Hi, I'm Ari Lewis, the host of Mastering the Attention Economy podcast presented by Brand Street. Brand Street is a community of operators building brands through creative, unpaid marketing and media. Each week, I interview founders, operators, and creators to learn how they are earning attention for their brands without paying for it. If you want to learn more about Brand Street, visit brandstreet.co. If you use the code LEWIS, LEWIS, you'll receive 20% off a yearly subscription into the community. This week's guest is Austin Rief, co-founder of Morning Brew. In this episode, we discuss why there isn't a newsletter bubble, the future of media, and creator-led media companies. I hope you enjoy.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Happy to be here.
So, I've listened to a lot of your podcasts, follow your Twitter pretty in-depth, and I wanted to start with a topic that I think you haven't talked about as much on many of the podcasts that I've listened to you speak on, which is, starting with right before you joined Morning Brew. So, you attended the University of Michigan with Alex. He, started Morning Brew, and then you ended up joining him as a co-founder. But you were in investment banking as an intern right before you joined. Can you sort of talk about what that experience was like and why you decided that wasn't for you and ended up joining Alex and taking Morning Brew to the next level?
When I went to the University of Michigan, I really wanted to get into the business school, and I did. At the time, you got into the business school, most people got into the business school after freshman year, going into sophomore year. And when I joined the business school at Michigan, there's very much a herd mentality of everyone trying to go into finance. A little bit of consulting, but the vast majority of people want to go into finance. And at the time, and I don't know how it is now, but investment banking was the job everyone wanted to get. And so I very much latched on to that mindset of I want to get a job at the best bank I possibly can, go work in New York City in investment banking, then maybe go work in private equity afterwards. Very common path is to do 2 years in banking, 2 years in private equity. And I actually really did enjoy, and still do, thinking about things from a financial perspective. It's really interesting to think about things like M&A and raising capital and capital structure, things like that. And so I thought going into banking would make sense. The problem is you really don't get to think strategically as an analyst at an investment bank. I mean, really, until you get much more senior at an investment bank, but as an analyst. And so when I went there, the most of what I was doing was just creating Excel models. But one of the issues I see in finance, not everyone, but so many people view a financial model as just numbers on a page. And they don't realize that those numbers are actual inputs and outputs in the world. Those are people. And so a banker could just sit there and say, oh yeah, why don't we just change that cell from 7 to 10? And it's like, yeah, you can absolutely do that with numbers on a page, but what does that mean in the real world? And so I just didn't think that I was accomplishing much. And so the decision to do Morning Brew full time was fairly easy because I didn't really enjoy the work I was doing. And so I definitely learned a lot. And I think there's stuff to be, there's plenty to be learned in banking. And I think it's a good career accelerant. But for me, it just didn't make sense.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I feel like that's sort of a lot of people that I've met on Twitter where they started in banking and ended up, going into tech or media and whatnot. But, you joined Morning Brew and it's gone from 0 to 2 million plus subscribers and what's it been now, 5 years. And you guys were just recently bought by, Business Insider. Can you just talk more about what your role at the company was from, joining as the co-founder and COO and how it's evolved from, being the second, person with Alex to now being a large company that's a subsidiary of Business Insider?
Yeah, so when I joined Morning Brew, it wasn't even called Morning Brew. It was called Market Corner. And it was a PDF Alex was sending out. And that was end of 2014. And we spent the first 2 months of 2015 transforming it from a PDF called Market Corner to a newsletter called Morning Brew. And from there, we were college students, and Alex and I really split roles in the beginning, where initially he really focused on sales and editorial, and I focused on growth uh, and getting the newsletter to be as big as possible. And that was, I think about things very much from a distribution lens, and that's not just for media, it's for all companies, but specifically in media. And I came to work every day thinking, how can we get more high quality subscribers signed up to Morning Brew? And now, as the COO, I run the day to day of the business, and I make sure everything is running efficiently, and make sure that teams are communicating. I oversee the leadership team, and the company now is right around 75 people, and so my focus is to make sure as we scale from January of last year we had 25, January of this year we're at I think 70ish, and growing pretty quickly, to make sure that the wheels don't fall off the wagon, so to speak, and we make sure we keep our North Star and continue to create great content, build a great culture, and just continue to grow the business.
So, one of the things at Morning Brew that I found interesting, that obviously was a very good decision on your end, is you raised very little venture. But the venture you did raise, can you talk about what prompted that decision to raise a round, and what you guys did with the money?
Yeah, so we graduated in 2017, but we started in 2015. And if you would have asked me what we were going to do in 2015, if we would have went full time, I would have said we would have raised a lot of money. There were companies raising tens of millions of dollars in 2015 and 2016 to pivot to video and to really grow impressions. It was all about reach at the time. And by 2017, in 2015, 2016, Facebook was really amplifying this reach of media companies and really flexing their muscle, so to speak, and showing media companies how much power they had. They started to pull that back in 2017, and that strategy of pivoting to video really didn't work. Although there was a lot of value to be had, it just went all of Facebook and Google. And so in 2017, we said, yeah, we have a newsletter. Let's just focus on this. It seems like it's working. And we just had this belief from day one that if we could get to 1 million subscribers and we could create great content and our audience engage with that content, and we can make great relationships with partners, we could begin to build a really great business. We didn't know what revenue we were going to do at 1 million subscribers. We didn't know who we were going to work with, but we had this belief if we could get to 1 million, it would be, it would be really, really, it could become a big business. And so in 2017, we said, well, for a newsletter business, we didn't need to raise millions of dollars, but we knew we needed to hire writers, because Alex and I, one of the first things we said is we're not good enough to be the writers of this thing full time. And we knew we needed to put some money into paid acquisition. So we decided we raise $500,000, $1 million, whatever it may be. And it's not ever as scientific as people make it out to be. We said, okay, let's split the difference, $750,000. We hired a couple of writers, we hired a salesperson, we hired a growth marketer, and we were really off to the races with a really lean team, creating great content, selling that content, and growing the newsletter.
So, one of the things that I've seen you talk a lot about on Twitter is sort of your stance against companies raising a lot of venture money in the media space. And obviously, you put your money where your mouth is, in the sense of you also chose not to raise a lot of money, and it ended up being a very good decision for you all. Does it ever make sense, and a lot of the listeners are in the media space, where it does make sense to raise a lot of money for a media company? Or do you think that, sort of the path that you took should be the norm? I think one of the things that we've seen in the venture world specifically is that, people are trying to get venture returns with media companies when they don't scale like tech companies. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't want to make generalizations, because I think I define media as very broad. But if you are launching as a standard or fairly standard ad-based publisher, I don't think venture capital makes sense. Whether you're a podcast business, or you are a digital, written business, or you're building on social or on whatever it may be, I don't think raising a ton of or a lot of venture capital early on makes sense. There are some businesses where I think it does make sense, right? If you have a very high dollar bottom of funnel product, then maybe, right? If you're a subscription business, those I think are those have the economics to be a little bit more venture backable. But I always really like the mentality of raise a fairly small seed or pre-seed round and see where you get to in the media space. So I just think it depends on what your goals are and what you're trying to accomplish. But 99% of the time, I don't think you should be raising venture capital for media.
So, I want to sort of transition that to, you talked about ad-based businesses versus, these subscription businesses. When you did when you began Morning Brew, it was a daily newsletter, and you still have that core daily newsletter, but you ended up expanding into, other newsletter verticals now. You have Marketing Brew and Retail Brew. You also have a podcast. How did you all think about, the flywheel as everyone's starting to use as I think the next big buzzword, but where did you realize there were natural, synergies to expand? Because, one thing that everyone's really hot on right now is, these paid subscription newsletters, something that you all didn't do. So how do you think about those expansion plans, and how do you all still think about, the flywheel and where it makes sense to expand into and where you try to, maybe stray away from?
Yeah. So end of 2018, we had a very clear path to 1 million subscribers. We were probably 6 to 8 weeks away. We've been doing one thing and doing it exceptionally well for 2.5, 3 years. And, we sat down, we thought, what's next? And when we thought about what's next, two things came to mind, right? We wanted to make people better or smarter at their jobs, right? Morning Brew makes people more informed about the general business world, and it goes a mile wide and inch deep. And we thought there was potential to go deeper within certain verticals, certain areas in which people work in. And that launched our B2B business. So we launched Emerging Tech Brew, we launched Retail Brew, and then more recently we launched Marketing Brew. And that is pretty simple in my mind. We're taking the same tone, style, format that we created for Morning Brew and translating that into these areas in which people work in. And that's a depth business, right? We're trying to go deeper. So we're going to create more content for those same people. It's higher CPM advertising, smaller audiences, and now we're focused on creating webinars and deep dives and things, and having more impressions per person for those products. And on the B2C side, we said, how can we create content that caters to passion audiences of the Morning Brew audience? And we decided we don't just want to do that in newsletter, right? Our audience exists beyond newsletter. Newsletters are an incredible place to start. You own that relationship with your audience. You get to send you're not reliant on Facebook or Instagram or Google, but our audience doesn't only exist in newsletter. And so our goal is to go where our audience is now that we have that really great business and we've built that flywheel newsletter, and start to expand and test and experiment with social, video content, audio content like we do with Business Casual. And we're going to launch more products there. But also, we don't just want to go into news, right? We're a psychographic company. We picked a type of person, young, hungry, modern business leader, future decision makers, and we want to create more content that they care about. And so right now we do news, but there are other areas they care about, things like business analysis, things like investing, things like productivity, things like work-life culture. And we want to create content that caters to those people. And so that's the plan. It's definitely ambitious. And it's something we're really, really excited about, is to put the Morning Brew reader at the center of the diagram and think about, as the hub, and think about what are the other spokes beyond just daily news that we can hit them with, that they're going to enjoy and engage with.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I love sort of, how you think about it as a persona-based model of, does the flywheel make sense for this type of person? So, that's really interesting to hear you say firsthand. I wanted to talk about the advertising side of things because, you mentioned it. I think one of the things that we talk a lot about on the podcast is, earned and owned media, and I don't talk a ton about paid. It's not really my area of expertise, but I think one thing that we've seen that's been interesting and probably a bit overblown is, they're talking about a lot of like paid social fraud of, the Facebook and Google were inflating numbers and whatnot. But I think one of the most interesting things that's been a result of that is, people really don't, want to always do programmatic. They're trying to look at, investing more money in stuff like newsletter ads. But one of the problems with that channel is, it's hard to scale, obviously. So do you, see a future where, this Facebook Google duopoly is going to, become threatened by like newsletters, and we're going to see more ad inventory that's not necessarily programmatic in nature? Or, what are your sort of thoughts on this, I think, ever-changing advertising landscape that we're seeing play out?
Yeah, I mean, no one's going to compete with Facebook and Google, right? No publisher, Substack's not going to. That doesn't mean people aren't going to be successful, right? I really like Substack, and I really hope they succeed. I think it's a great opportunity, but that is creating value. It's not taking value away. I think, media is, when thought about more generally, right? Not just when thought about as an ad-based business, but when you think about subscription and you think about ads and you think about media being top of funnel for online courses or whatever it may be, I think we're still very much in a positive sum game where someone can leave the New York Times. The New York Times will still have the same value it had before, and they can go to Substack and they will find 1,000 people to pay them $100 a year because their content is good, and that is very much positive sum. And so I think there's just so much opportunity. I think people are starting to look at media in really interesting ways and not just view it as, let me create another digital publisher that arbitrages articles on Facebook or Google, but instead being really strategic, think about what's the value of media. One of the most scarce commodity is a trusted relationship with people. And when you have that, what can you do with that? And one thing you can do is you can, sell the audience. You can serve ads to them, but also you can sell to the audience. You can sell them things. And I think more and more people are going to start to figure out things to sell to the audience and not just subscription, right? So obviously there's commerce, you can create swag, but I think there are all kinds of options. There are all types of opportunities, and I think it's a really interesting time.
Yeah, and I probably know the answer to, you definitely, I would guess without putting, hopefully not putting words in your mouth, don't think there's a newsletter bubble, and probably think there's a lot of opportunities in the future, for people to create newsletters. Obviously Substack is growing, and I think we all hope it does well. But where do you see the biggest opportunities right now in the newsletter space? Because I feel like a lot of people are creating the same newsletters, but like someone who lived in Cleveland, 99% of the population has never heard of Substack. And I think I've always felt that one of the biggest opportunities is like, how do we reach those people? Because it shocked me how many people didn't even subscribe to any newsletter that when I met them in Cleveland. So, from your point of view of, now that you guys have, 2 million plus subscribers, where do you see opportunities for whether it's individuals or larger publishers to create newsletter, businesses?
Yeah, so I definitely don't believe there is a newsletter bubble or newsletter fatigue. I think this is what happens with anything, right? When the market gets flooded with anything and it's free, you try a bunch of stuff, and then you keep what works, and you get rid of what doesn't work. So I think some of these people early on in the newsletter game, maybe their numbers were inflated because they were the first political newsletter, and therefore everyone signed up for them. Everyone gave it a try, because one thing Substack does such a good job of is they make it so easy to start a newsletter and so easy to get signed up for newsletters. But ultimately, there is opportunity for content, great content, within every single niche, and there are essentially infinite niches. And so I think there's a ton of opportunity for newsletters. It's just they may not be venture backable opportunities. They might not be $10 million opportunities, but are there opportunities within these verticals? Yes. I think what people are going to need to figure out is what business model makes sense for what they're doing. So, for example, if you are creating a newsletter, which actually I want to create, I want someone to create this, and I want to work with them to do it. Is let's say you're creating a newsletter that is targeting sales leaders at sales businesses or sales leaders at SaaS businesses, helping them, scale their team. That's a great opportunity to do paid because it's a B2B newsletter. And so you can expense that for a couple $100. And I think people like Lenny, who I'm a huge fan of, who writes a growth marketing newsletter, he's a great example of, that's good to go subscription. I think there are a lot of other newsletters that are more interest-based, more B2C, where like sports. I don't think the future of sports substackers are paid newsletters. That doesn't mean they can't have a free newsletter. It doesn't mean they can't monetize. I just don't think they're going to monetize through subscriptions. So I think it's about aligning the business model with the content and with what you're doing and what you're creating. And I think people are going to figure out in every niche. I think right now everyone thinks they're an amazing content creator, and I think most people aren't. It's really hard to create great content, and it's even harder to create content that people are willing to pay for.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's sort of, we started a paid community with my audience like 3 weeks ago, and as with a really specific focus on like earned and owned media professionals, and my inspiration came from what Lenny was building, and it's been amazing to watch him grow it and scale it. So, I definitely agree with you there. One, I guess, interesting thing, though, that stands out from Lenny and sort of what I'm curious to hear your thoughts on is what we're seeing with Substack is the emphasis on the creator. And, I think what a lot of these publishers and take you all at Morning Brew, it's not Austin and Alex, it's Morning Brew, but Lenny is obviously tied to Lenny, and even at scale you have people like Mr. Beast tied to Mr. Beast. Do you think those types of models are sustainable over time where there's so much emphasis on the creator, or do you think there's going to be this shift of how can the creators scale themselves and not tie the company necessarily to their name and figure out how to build a brand value behind it? Like, what are your thoughts on sort of, is this creator, economy, revolution, whatever terms people want to use, sustainable, or do you think content burnout is a real issue and something to be on the radar for a lot of these folks?
I think there is no, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but it comes back to goals, right? I think the best way to get to cash flow and to make a replacement for your salary is to make you the brand. Right? People connect with people. People don't really connect with brands as much. And so I think the Austin Rief newsletter would do much better to, if it was paid, let's say, to create and drive subscriptions than if I named it, I don't know, something else. But I think calling it the Austin Rief newsletter, the Lenny newsletter, or the Ari newsletter, or whoever else, I think that can make it more difficult to build equity value, sell it at some point, have someone else run it at some point. I think it makes it more challenging. So it's a trade-off. But I think there are ways to get around it, right? Could you create a newsletter that's your newsletter, but the community is not your community, it's something else, and then that community, you figure out how to use your newsletter to jumpstart it, but at some point you disassociate them, let it run on its own, and prove that it has individual value. That, to me, that's really interesting. And so I think all these things have merit. It's just about finding the right balance, right? Which isn't a great answer, but the answer is you have to find the right business model for the right person, the right goals, and do a really good job at it. There's nothing that is rocket science, but that doesn't mean it's easy.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying, and I think overall, and probably one thing that we agree on at the end of the day is with all of this, like, as long as you're getting the content out there consistently, and you have that niche, you'll grow. So then from there, it's just figuring out what your goals are and what you want to do with it. But, as we begin to wrap things up, the question that I always like to end on is, you've been at Morning Brew. It's been like 6 years now, or 2015. Oh yeah, so 6 years. What are that one takeaway, that one big lesson that you've learned that you'd love to impart on the audience if for their day to day and their professional career?
Yeah, there's been so many things, and I could take this in a bunch of different directions, but I think in terms of building a business, it mostly just comes down to people, and it's impossible to spend too much time thinking about the future of the company and do I have the right people, and are these the right people to take me to the next level, and am I hiring too fast or too slow, and setting the right expectations. At the end of the day, a business is just a series of people, and so that is just the most important thing, is thinking about how does every decision I make affect the people in the business, and how is that going to affect the people in the business in 3, 6, 9, 12 months. And so it's something that's really hard because you're so focused on the here and now, so focused on trying to get to tomorrow. But if you don't think about the people you have and the people you're going to need, and how to ensure that you set the right expectations with the people you have, it's going to be a challenge. So everything comes back to people when it comes to starting a business.
Got it. Well, Austin, thanks so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I'll have your, social links in the show notes, but for those listening or watching on YouTube, can you just share, your Twitter handle and any other, socials that you'd like for the audience to know?
Yeah, the Twitter is Austin_Rief, RIEF.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Austin. And until next time, everyone. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider giving us 5 stars on iTunes. If you're listening to us on YouTube, consider hitting the like button and commenting on what you enjoyed. I'd really appreciate it.